So you're making a game? That's great. So the first question to maybe ask yourself is, who's this game for? If you're working on your own, a pretty obvious answer is it's for me. I'm the target audience. I'm making a game that I want to make, that I want to play. And in a lot of ways, that's a pretty good answer for individual development or very small teams. You know the kind of games you like to play. You're immediately available for testing. The communication loop is incredibly tight. It's just play it. Do you like it? No. Twiddle around with it. Play it again. Keep doing that until you get the thing that you want to play. Now, you may or may not represent a larger audience. You're a little team, so maybe you don't care that much. As you move from one person to two person to three people, there can become some complexity involved with me being the target audience, because unless you're going to be the person making all of the decisions, now you have lots of different me's. There are 2 or 3 or 4 of you, and you need to have some sort of consensus on what me means. 2 obvious options. You can make it be a single person, but that can quickly become a bottleneck. And it's a little disempowering for the other members of the team if their opinions aren't really factored in the design and game making of the game that you're trying to make together. Makes sense in some cases, depending on the structure of your team. The other option is that you all are me. And this can be great because potentially that circle of audience gets bigger as it includes different opinions from different people. There is a risk that if you aren't careful, that instead of getting the union of your different game making desires, you actually end up getting the intersection. If one of you really likes crunchy, really thinky puzzles, and another one of you really loves high octane action combat, making a game that combines those two things, it might be a breakout amazing hit, or it might be something that there really isn't a very big audience for. Something to keep in mind as you start to grow the who me is. When it's just one person, well, you know that there is at least an audience of one. When it's the combination of a bunch of people, there is a risk that it could end up being an audience of 0. Now, I don't know that I've ever seen that happen, but it's something to think about. The other thing you're going to need to figure out as me becomes several people is how do you resolve situations where the feature desires of the different me's are incompatible. This is different than you're just adding different features that may or may not work together really well. What if the single feature actually has different desired outcomes? I want to be able to pause in combat. I want to be able to look around. I want to be able to think about what I'm going to do. You want reflex-driven, no pause, hardcore, twitch-based game. Those two features are overlapping each other and they kind of contradict each other. So how do you resolve that conflict? I don't think that running your design as a democracy is a good way to go, because you're going to end up with something pretty inconsistent in most cases, because what's going to happen is that sometimes one side is going to win, sometimes the other, and you're going to be swinging your design all over the place. But if it's not a democracy, then ultimately there needs to be somebody that is making that decision. There needs to be a synthesis point where the decision making, when there is conflict, is combining. But let's swing it all the way to the other extreme. Let's say you're this guy. You released this very popular game, and now you're working on a sequel. So who's the audience for this game? Who's this game for? A bunch of things start to complicate this. First of all, this game came out a long time ago on what I think we can all agree is the best stunt date of all time, November 11th, 2011. So it's already been 12 years and the game hasn't even come out yet. Are the people who played that original game your core target audience? Maybe. There's definitely been enough time for their tastes to change. There's definitely been enough time for new people to become gamers and for old people to stop playing games. So that audience is different than it was when that game came out in the first place. But also, this isn't the sequel to a single game. This is the continuation of a franchise. In fact, this will be the 6th game in the franchise. So is it people who played all 5 of the previous games that's your target audience? Or some sort of overlap? And because it's been so long since you played this game, you've also ported this to a bunch of other platforms. Basically, every single thing that has a chip in it that can play a game has got a port of your game. So does that reset the equation as well? Instead of it being a game that came out more than 12 years ago, is it something else? Does that change the math? And you've also released some other things along the way, things that share a lot of characteristics with this game. They're RPGs and they are driven by open world gameplay. And those are much more recent. So are they your target audience? And there have been a lot of other RPGs from other companies along the way as well. And how does that change the mathematics? Oh, wait, and also, didn't you release an MMO in the same universe as this game? Is that an audience as well? People who became familiar with this setting through an entirely different genre? And the short answer is, to some degree, all of these different possibilities are your target audience, or target audiences. And as your game gets bigger and broader and appeals to more and more people, your target audience isn't a single person or a single persona. It's a bunch of different people. The next Elder Scrolls is targeting Skyrim fanatics. It is targeting people who came into Bethesda games with Starfield or with Fallout. It is targeting the broader RPG marketplace. People who never played an RPG before they played Hogwarts Legacy. Because the game came out so long ago, some of your audience potentially has aged out of games. And some of the people who are going to potentially play your game weren't even born when your last game came out. So you need to consider these all to some degree. How do you go about doing that? Some degree of user testing is useful, but like I talked about before, you do ultimately have to understand that the decision making is coming down to you at some point. But understanding some broad personas can help you understand when you're making decisions that are serving one persona versus another persona, things as well when you are making a choice that is potentially going to turn one persona off, but it is worth it because it is a beneficial feature for another persona. So in the case of Elder Scrolls 6, you might have Skyrim fan as one of your personas. And indeed, you might even break that into 2. You might have Skyrim fan played it in 2011. It's been 12 years. Therefore, their tastes have evolved and changed versus played a recent upres port of Skyrim. And therefore, they're much more anchored closer to what the original Skyrim is. You might have Starfield players as another persona. You might have Elden Ring or open world, non-Bethesda open world players as another group. Alternatively, you might divide these groups up by motivations. People who love exploring, people who love combat, people who love narrative or puzzles. The advantage of doing it that way, as opposed to dividing it up by sort of purchase cohort, is that those groups are relevant regardless of how they entered into the ecosystem. It's more about the way they play games and the kinds of features that they are interested in, which is probably more relevant to your decision-making process. And you can weigh these against each other, and you can learn things, and you can consider things. And it's useful to think about this. It can become paralyzing to some degree. And this is why, for me, it is ultimately going to eventually come back to, you're the decision maker, you're going to have to make the choice. Having this conversation with yourself, with the team, can help inform a lot of decision making. And as we've discussed a lot on this channel, making a game is about making tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of decisions. And any tool you can have that helps those decisions be made is ultimately useful. So who is this game for? It could just be for you. It could be for tens of millions of people. But even in that case, it's ultimately kind of coming back to you. Having this conversation, understanding those goals, figuring out that synthesis point for you when you're going to be the one making those calls is what's going to allow you to make the decisions that need to be made to make the best game you can make. Having that conversation as you go And refreshing that conversation is going to help you make a game that is going to better serve the ultimate players of the game. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there is a link to that down in the description. We also have merch now. I'm wearing Control the Triage, Control the Project. If you're interested in picking something up, there's a shelf for that below this video. Are you looking forward to Elder Scrolls 6? Which version of these do you think you are? Are you a hardcore Daggerfall player and you want to return to the glory days of a game from 20 years ago? Are you someone who only heard about Bethesda when Starfield came out and you want something that's more in that vein? Let's talk about that down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.